A rooster crows. A gentle breeze ripples through the trees lining a quiet street. Sunlight glints off the windows of modest homes, each one a potential hiding place for adventure or intrigue. Cobblestone alleys echo with the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer or the measured tap of a carpenter's mallet. Somewhere in the distance, a baker's oven glows warmly as it begins its morning work. This is Philadelphia in the 1770s. It's not quite dawn yet, but the day has begun for those who call this city home. Among them, a young man named Sam, who's up before sunrise. He works in his father's print shop, which is filled with the comforting aroma of ink and paper. Today's work is simple, reprinting some handbills for an upcoming play at the city tavern. But when Sam arrives, he notices something different. An unusual document lying on the counter. It seems to be a rough draft of a handbill for an event at the Pennsylvania State House, and scrunched up at the bottom of the page, barely visible, is a strange drawing. Could it be? Yes, it's the first known sketch of the first American flag. In the following pages, we'll follow Samuel and his friends as they navigate the challenges of their early American world. Along the way, they'll make discoveries that will help us better understand our own nation's beginnings, because despite its beauty, this seemingly tranquil world is actually a powder keg ready to explode. There's just one problem. Nobody knows it. Yet, colonial Philadelphia was nothing like the bustling metropolis we know today. In fact, it was so quiet at night. Residents would call out "Beware of dogs" to alert passers-by to their presence. Cobblestone streets were bumpy and often unpaved, lined by sturdy but unadorned brick and stone houses with gardens out front and wood fences around back. The town was peaceful, almost sleepy. In the evening, families gathered in their candlelit parlors for lively discussions about the latest news from Europe or for sewing circles. While outside, the only sounds were the distant creak of a ship's pulley or the chirp of crickets. Of course, there was plenty of activity in the taverns, too. Taverns were the social centers of colonial life, where merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers came to swap stories over mugs of beer or cider or to catch up on the latest news. Here, men of different ranks could come together and speak their minds freely. They might discuss politics or trade or simply enjoy the company of others. These gatherings were important for forging bonds of community and camaraderie, and for some, it was here that they became aware of the growing tensions between Great Britain and her American colonies. But overall, life in Philadelphia and other colonial towns was rather gentle. For the most part, people went about their daily lives without much thought of the turmoil that was brewing on the horizon. After all, how could anyone have predicted that this peaceful scene would soon be shattered by the fury of revolution? As Samuel unfolds the old document, he can't help but feel a sense of pride and wonder. Here he is, a young apprentice, about to witness a piece of history firsthand. His mind races with questions. Wardrotis, wie sit ere? And what does it all mean? As he studies the drawing, he begins to piece together the clues. He knows that the event depicted must be the grand ball held at the Pennsylvania State House on December 12, 1774. The Continental Congress had convened in Philadelphia on September 5, 1774, and delegates from each colony were present. Many arrived in fine attire, eager to make their voices heard on the matter of increasing British taxes on goods such as tea, glass, lead, and paper. The ball was meant to foster camaraderie among these leaders as they prepared to address these critical issues. The sketch shows a grand room with elegantly dressed men and women dancing. There's a long table laden with food and drink and a crowd of people conversing animatedly. But it's the flag that truly captures Samuel's attention. He traces its outline, committing it to memory, knowing that this may be the only surviving record of its existence. Flags have always played an important role in world history, representing nations, communities, and causes. When the United States declared independence from Britain, it needed a symbol to represent the new nation. The first American flag, also known as the Grand Union Flag, or the Continental Colors, was a significant symbol of the American Revolution and the birth of the United States. The origins of the first American flag are shrouded in mystery, with several theories attempting to explain how it came to be designed. One popular legend attributes the creation of the flag to a woman named Betsy Ross. According to this story, George Washington, John Adams, and other members of the Continental Congress visited Betsy Ross's shop to request a new flag. They wanted a design that would symbolize the union between the northern and southern colonies, as well as their break from British rule. Betsy Ross is said to have suggested a flag with stars representing the colonies and alternating red and white stripes to represent their unity. While this story is widely known, there's no historical evidence to support it. Another theory suggests that the first American flag was designed by a committee of the Continental Congress. This committee, which reportedly included John Hancock and Samuel Adams, tasked a printer named Isaiah West with creating a flag that would serve as a rallying point for the colonists. West's design reportedly featured 13 stars in a circle on a blue field, with each star representing a colony. This design is similar to the modern flag of the United States, but it's unclear whether it was ever adopted by the Continental Congress. Historians believe that the first American flag was flown on December 12, 1774, at a Graham Ball held at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. This event, which was attended by members of the Continental Congress, was intended to promote unity and solidarity among the colonies. However, the identity of the person who flew the first American flag remains unknown. Despite the mystery surrounding its origins, the first American flag is an important symbol in U.S. history. It represents the ideals of liberty, independence, and self-governance that have shaped the nation since its founding. Today, the flag is on display at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, where visitors can come to pay tribute to this iconic piece of Americana. Samuel carefully preserves the document, knowing that he may have just stumbled upon something truly special. He thinks about the men and women who attended the ball, the hopes and dreams they had for the future of their fledgling nation. He wonders what they might have looked like, what they might have talked about, and how they might have felt when they first saw the American flag flying high above them. He realizes that he's standing on the shoulders of giants, that his own life and the future of his country are shaped by the decisions and actions of those who came before him. As he continues his work in the print shop, Samuel can't help but feel inspired. He knows that he's a part of something bigger than himself, that he's helping to build a new nation based on the ideals of freedom and democracy. He takes pride in his work, knowing that he's playing a small part in shaping the future of America. And as the sun sets over Philadelphia, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, Samuel can't help but feel a sense of hope for the future of his country. What did the first American flag look like? What do you think of when you hear the phrase, first American flag? Do you picture the iconic stars and stripes of the modern U.S. flag? Or perhaps you imagine a simple banner with the words liberty or independence emblazoned upon it? Whatever your vision may be, the reality is that the first American flag was actually quite different from what we know today. The exact design of the first American flag is a matter of some debate among historians, as there are several sketches and descriptions of early American flags from the Revolutionary War era. Each one offers a slightly different glimpse into what these symbols of patriotism looked like during the nation's formative years. Some of the earliest known sketches of American flags date back to 1775 and were created by an artist named John Trumbull. These paintings depict flags with varying numbers of stars and stripes, offering a possible glimpse into the evolution of the flag's design. However, it's important to note that these works are not definitive proof of what the flag looked like, as they may be based on memory or imagination rather than first-hand observation. In addition to Trumbull's paintings, there are written descriptions of American flags from the Revolutionary War era that provide some clues as to their appearance. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a letter written by a British naval officer named John Paul Jones in 1778. Jones describes seeing a variety of American flags during his time in North America, including a large flag that flew from the stern of a warship. This flag, according to Jones, featured 13 red and white stripes and a blue square in the upper corner, containing 13 white stars arranged in a circle. While this description is valuable, it is important to remember that Jones was an outsider to the American Revolution, and his account may not fully capture the complexities and nuances of the flag's symbolism and design. So what did the first American flag actually look like? Unfortunately, there's no single definitive answer to this question. The available evidence, including sketches and written descriptions, provides a tantalizing glimpse into the evolution of one of America's most enduring symbols. But ultimately, the mystery surrounding the first American flag only adds to its allure. It serves as a reminder of the countless individuals who fought for independence and the establishment of a new nation, and it invites us to continue exploring the rich history of the United States and its journey towards becoming a global superpower. Thanks for watching. See you next time. In Chapter 1, we discussed how George Washington and 2 other members of the Continental Congress approached Rebecca Young and asked her to design a flag for the new nation of America, and that led to the creation of the first American flag with the stars and stripes. But in Chapter 1, I also mentioned that there was some debate as to whether Rebecca Young actually made the first American flag, or if it was a woman named Betsy Ross. So in this chapter, we're going to look at who Betsy Ross was and see how she came to be involved in the creation of the first American flag. Betsy Ross was the name most people knew Elizabeth Griscom. But she was born into a Quaker family in Philadelphia in 1752. Her father, Samuel Griscom, was a wealthy merchant, but he died when Betsy was only 6 years old. So her uncle, Thomas Griscom, helped raise her. Thomas was one of the founding members of the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, which had been formed in England in the mid-17th century. When they arrived in America, they were a small group of people who held certain beliefs that went against those of the established Church of England. They believed that all people were equal in the eyes of God and rejected the rituals and formalities of the Church. They also believed in pacifism, which meant they did not believe in war or military service. The Quakers were often persecuted in England for their beliefs. So many of them, including Thomas and Samuel Griscom, immigrated to the New World. After Samuel died, Thomas took his niece, Betsy, and his grandnephew, also named Samuel, Intoes, Ome. He became Betsy's legal guardian and helped provide for her education. Growing up in a Quaker household, Betsy learned to read and write. This was unusual for girls at the time. Normally, girls would only learn how to do needlework and other domestic tasks. Betsy also developed strong morals and values from her Quaker upbringing, which would influence her later life. When Betsy was 14, she began working as an apprentice for an upholsterer. This was another unusual thing for a girl her age to do. An upholsterer was someone who made and repaired furniture, especially chairs, sofas, and beds, by stretching fabric over wooden frames. As an apprentice, Betsy learned the skills of the trade, such as sewing and designing. In those days, furniture was expensive, and reupholstering old furniture was a common way to save money. Since women were expected to learn domestic skills, reupholstering furniture wasn't beneath them. And in fact, it was considered a high-quality skill for a young woman to know. During her apprenticeship, Betsy would have worked alongside other women in a shop setting, learning how to cut and sew fabrics. She also likely learned how to make decorative items such as tassels and fringe. At the end of her apprenticeship, she would have had a portfolio of work to show potential customers. If she chose to become a master upholsterer, she could open her own shop where she would hire other women to help her make and repair furniture. In 1773, Betsy married John Ross, a well-to-do young man from a prominent family. John was also a member of the Religious Society of Friends, and together he and Betsy shared a commitment to pacifism and equality. They lived in a house on Arch Street in Philadelphia, where Betsy continued to hone her sewing and design skills. A few years later, when the Revolutionary War broke out between the American colonies and Great Britain, John joined the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, a group that opposed slavery. He also served as a member of the Pennsylvania Assembly. Throughout the war, Betsy continued to make quilts and other household items for her family, but she also used her skills to support the war effort. She made flags and clothing for soldiers and provided supplies to hospitals and refugee camps. It was during this time that Betsy Ross became acquainted with several members of the Continental Congress, which was the governing body of the American colonies during the war. These were men who represented the colonies at meetings and made decisions about how to respond to British policies. One of these men was George Washington, who was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. On June 14, 1777, George Washington and 2 members of the Continental Congress, Robert Morris and George Sparks, went to Philadelphia to visit a friend of theirs, John Ross. At the time, John was serving in the Pennsylvania Assembly and was a leader in the movement for independence from Britain. When the 3 men arrived at the Ross home, Betsy was there to greet them. The 4 of them were friends and had spent many hours discussing politics and the future of the country. But this particular day would change history forever. According to legend, After the men entered the house, George Washington turned to Betsy and said, "Mrs. Ross, can you cut and make a flag for me?" He explained that the Continental Congress had chosen him to design a flag for the new nation of America, but he had been unable to come up with a suitable design, so he had come to Betsy for help. Betsy thought for a moment. She knew that this was an important task, and she wanted to come up with a design that would represent the new nation well. She told the men that she needed some time to think about it, so they left her alone with a piece of fabric and some scissors. As she looked at the fabric, she thought about the ideas of liberty and independence that had been discussed so much lately. She thought about the people who had fought so hard for the right to govern themselves, and the future they were hoping to create for their children. As she cut into the fabric, she had an idea. She would make a flag with stars and stripes. The stars would represent the different colonies, and the stripes would represent the unity of the colonies. She cut out 5 pointed stars from blue fabric and arranged them in a circle on the piece of material. Then she cut long strips of red and white fabric and sewed them together to form the stripes. When the men returned, they were amazed at what she had created. They asked her how she had come up with the design, and she told them about her thoughts on liberty, independence, and the unity of the colonies. They agreed that it was a perfect design and asked her to make a full-size flag for them. Betsy finished the flag and presented it to General Washington, who was so pleased with the design that he ordered 12 more flags from her. These flags were used throughout the war and became known as the Betsy Ross flags. After the war, Betsy continued to make flags and other items for the new nation. She was proud to have played a part in the creation of the United States and the flag that would come to symbolize it. But there is one thing that you should know. There is no physical evidence that Betsy Ross ever made a flag for George Washington or anyone else. No flags from that time period can be definitively linked to her, even though she did make flags. All we have are stories and legends that claim she did. Some historians believe that the story of how Betsy Ross made the first American flag is just that. A story. They say that while Betsy did live in Philadelphia and make flags, there is no proof that she made the first American flag. Instead, they point to Rebecca Young, who also lived in Philadelphia and whose brother was a member of the Continental Congress. Others argue that it doesn't even really matter who made the first flag because many people contributed to its design and creation. What do you think? Do you think Betsy Ross made the first American flag, or do you think Rebecca Young did? Maybe you think it doesn't matter. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now check out Chapter 3, Who Was Rebecca Young, to learn more about the woman who may have made the very first American flag. Or jump to any other chapter in this series by clicking on the chapters in the playlist above. I'm the host. This is American Stories. And remember, you are amazing. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, in Chapter 3, we're diving into a pivotal and often heartbreaking period of Betsy Ross's life. Her marriage and the immense hardships she faced as a young woman. This chapter truly reveals the strength and resilience that would come to define her. So, let's set the scene. Betsy is a young, skilled apprentice, and it's during this time that she meets a fellow apprentice named John Ross. There was an immediate connection between them. John wasn't just another upholsterer. He was charming, ambitious, and they shared a passion for their craft. It was a classic love story in the making. But, as with many great love stories, there was a major complication. You see, Betsy was raised in a strict Quaker family. The Quakers, or the Religious Society of Friends, had very specific rules and customs, and one of the most important ones was that members should only marry within their faith. John Ross, however, was an Anglican, a member of the Church of England. For Betsy, this was a monumental dilemma. To marry John would mean defying her family, her community, and the only way of life she had ever known. This wasn't a decision she took lightly. Imagine the internal conflict, the love for her family and faith on one side, and the love for this man on the other. In the end, her heart won. In 1773, at the age of 21, Betsy and John eloped. They crossed the Delaware River to New Jersey and were married at a tavern. This act of marrying out of unity, as the Quakers called it, had immediate and severe consequences. Betsy was formally read out of the Quaker meeting. This meant she was disowned by her religious community, while she remained close with her immediate family. This separation was undoubtedly a painful experience. cutting her off from the social and spiritual support system she had grown up with. It was a tremendous sacrifice for love, and it marked her first major step into a life of independence, a life she would have to build for herself. But what they built together was truly special. After their marriage, Betsy and John put their shared skills to use and started their own upholstery business on Arch Street in Philadelphia. This was a bold move. They weren't just husband and wife, they were business partners. They poured all their energy into their little shop, repairing furniture, sewing draperies, and creating beautiful interiors for the city's elite. Their combined talent quickly earned them a good reputation. They were a team, building a future together, piece by piece, stitch by stitch. For a brief period, things were looking bright. They had each other, their business was growing, and they were making a name for themselves in a bustling, vibrant city. However, this happy chapter was tragically short. As Betsy and John were building their life, the world around them was descending into chaos. The winds of revolution were blowing fiercely through the American colonies. Tensions with Great Britain were escalating, and the call for independence was growing louder every day. Philadelphia, as the meeting place for the Continental Congress, was the very heart of this revolutionary fervor. John Ross, like many young patriots, felt a strong sense of duty. He joined the local militia, ready to defend the cause of liberty. This decision, noble as it was, would change Betsy's life forever. In mid-January of 1776, while guarding an ammunition depot, there was a massive explosion. John was severely injured. Despite the best available care, his wounds were too great. Just a few days later, John Ross died. At the age of just 24, after less than 3 years of marriage, Betsy was a widow. The man she had sacrificed so much for, the partner with whom she had built her dreams, was gone. She was left alone to run their business and navigate a city on the brink of war. This was a devastating blow, one that would have broken many people. Think about it. She had already been separated from her religious community, and now she had lost her husband, her partner, and her greatest supporter. This period of hardship is absolutely crucial to understanding the woman Betsy would become. She wasn't just a seamstress, she was a survivor. Left widowed at such a young age, during one of the most tumultuous times in American history, Betsy had a choice. She could crumble under the weight of her grief and loss, or she could persevere. And persevere she did. She took sole control of the upholstery business. In an era when it was incredibly difficult for a woman to run a business alone, she kept it afloat. She continued to take on clients, manage the finances, and perfect her craft. This experience forged in her an incredible independence and a steely resolve. It was this strength, born from tragedy, that prepared her for the challenges and the legendary opportunities that lay ahead. She had proven to herself and to the world that she could stand on her own 2 feet, even in the face of unimaginable loss. So, as we close this chapter, we see a transformed Betsy. She's no longer just the Quaker girl from a large family. She is a widow, a business owner, and a woman who has endured immense personal sacrifice for love and has been forced into self-reliance by tragedy. Her world has been turned upside down, but she is still standing, stronger and more resilient than ever. It's this Betsy Ross, tough, independent, and incredibly skilled artisan who is about to step onto the main stage of American history. Thank you so much for joining me for this part of Betsy's story. It's a somber but incredibly important chapter in her life. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up. And forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode, where things get asterisked. Very asterisk interesting. We'll see you next time. Well, hello there, and welcome to another exciting episode. In TSC series, we are exploring the places and spaces of Philadelphia during the time of the American Revolution. And in today's episode, we are going to look at Chapter 4, which is entitled Philadelphia in Revolution. This chapter is so important because it helps us understand the significance of the city as the site of some of the most important events of the war. So sit back, grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee or whatever else you like to drink, and let us dive right into it. Now, when we left off in episode 2, we had just finished reading about the experiences of John and Abigail Adams in Philadelphia during the winter of 1776. It was a difficult time for them personally, as they were living in a boarding house with their 2 young children and struggling to make ends meet financially. However, It was also an exciting time to be in the city as delegates from the Continental Congress were arriving to attend the first session of the newly formed government. And as we begin Chapter 4, we learn that Philadelphia was a natural hub of revolutionary activity, not only because it was centrally located, but also because it was home to many merchants who had an interest in seeing Great Britain lose the war. In fact, the city had been a hotbed of revolutionary activity since the Stamp Act of 1765, when merchants had organized a boycott of British goods in order to protest the tax. And by 1774, when the First Continental Congress met there, Philadelphia was known as the place to be if you wanted to be involved in the fight for independence. However, now that the Congress had moved to Philadelphia, things were different. Now the delegates were tasked with actually governing the colonies and making decisions that would affect the lives of all Americans. And this meant that the city had to be prepared to handle a large influx of people from all over the colonies. And this created both opportunities and challenges for those who lived there. For example, the influx of delegates, along with other people who came to the city to do business with the Congress, meant that there was a lot of money to be made in Philadelphia. Inns, taverns, and restaurants were packed, and merchants sold a variety of goods to the new arrivals. But this also meant that the city had to deal with a lot of problems, such as housing, food shortages, and crime. In addition, there was always the danger of violence. As we learned in the last episode, there were a lot of loyalists living in Philadelphia, and they were not happy with the direction the city and the country was taking. There were even rumors that the British were planning to take over the city and turn it into a British port. And so everyone in the city was on edge, not knowing when the fighting might start. Moreover, the mere presence of the Continental Congress gave Philadelphia a certain The city became the de facto capital of the United States, even though the official capital was still in New York. And this meant that all sorts of important documents were being written and signed there, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. And so we can see that Philadelphia was a city that was changing and growing during this time period. It was becoming more diverse as people from all over the colonies came there to do business or to take part in the revolution. And it was becoming more important as well, since it was the seat of the Continental Congress and the de facto capital of the United States. But what did this mean for the ordinary people who lived there, like Betsy? Well, for them, it meant that their lives were about to get a lot more complicated. As we learned in the last chapter, Betsy and her family had decided to stay in Philadelphia even after the British evacuated the city. And this was probably a very difficult decision for them to make, since they knew that the city was about to become a battleground between the Patriots and the British. However, they probably felt that it was too late to move anyway, since most of their belongings had already been confiscated by the British, and they could not afford to move their family elsewhere. Moreover, they may have felt a sense of patriotism and duty to stay in the city and help rebuild it after the war. Or they may have simply felt that they had no choice but to stay. After all, Philadelphia was the center of the revolution, and the Continental Congress had specifically requested that people stay in the city so that the work of the government would not be disrupted, whatever their reasons for staying. However, we can be sure that Betsy and her family were not the only ones who made this decision. In fact, thousands of people decided to stay in Philadelphia even after the British evacuated the city. These people were called stayers, and they represented a wide variety of social classes and political views. Some of them were loyalists who simply did not want to leave their homes. Others were undecided or even neutral, meaning that they were not interested in politics or the revolution. And still others were patriots who believed that it was their duty to stay in the city and help rebuild it after the war. However, whatever their motivations, the stayers were about to face a very difficult test. For although the British had evacuated Philadelphia on June, the city was still in a state of chaos. The buildings were damaged, the streets were dirty, and the people were afraid that the British were going to come back and retake the city. In addition, there was a shortage of food and supplies, and the people were living in fear of disease and violence. Moreover, the evacuation of the British had not been an easy task. Thousands of people had crowded into the city, trying to escape the advancing Patriots, and the British had done everything they could to make life miserable for them. They had destroyed buildings and crops, looted homes and businesses, and spread disease among the population. And so when the British finally left, the people of Philadelphia were exhausted and desperate for things to return to normal. Yet, they knew that this was not going to happen anytime soon. The war was still going on, and Philadelphia was still the seat of the Continental Congress. And this meant that the city would continue to be a target of the British. In fact, It was only a matter of time before the British returned to Philadelphia and laid siege to the city. However, in the meantime, life went on. Betsy Ross and her family continued to run their business and try to make an honest living. They probably had to deal with the same problems that everyone else in the city was facing, such as food shortages, crime, and violence. But they also had the added challenge of trying to keep their business afloat during a time of war. It was not easy to do business in Philadelphia during the Revolution. The city was constantly under threat of attack, and the economy was in a state of flux. However, Betsy and her family were able to survive and even thrive during this time period, and this was probably due to a combination of factors. First of all, Betsy was a very hard worker, and she was willing to take risks. She was not afraid to invest her money in order to make a profit, and she was willing to take on new challenges. Secondly, Betsy was very creative, and she was able to come up with new ways of doing business. She was not afraid to experiment, and she was willing to try new things. Finally, Betsy was very lucky. She was in the right place at the right time, and she was able to take advantage of the opportunities that were presented to her. Another factor that helped Betsy and her family survive during this time period was their decision to stay in Philadelphia when everyone else was leaving. When the British evacuated the city, most people fled to the countryside, and this left Philadelphia wide open for those who were willing to take advantage of it. Betsy and her family were able to stay in the city because they had nowhere else to go and because they were African American. They probably did not feel that they would be welcome in the countryside, and they were probably right. In fact, we know that many African Americans were not treated very well in the countryside. They were often enslaved, and they were not allowed to travel freely. Therefore, Betsy and her family probably felt that their best chance for survival was to stay in Philadelphia. Finally, we can say that Betsy and her family were able to survive during this time period because they had each other. They were a close-knit family, and they were able to rely on one another for support during difficult times. Betsy as mother and sister probably helped her to raise her children, and Betsy as husband probably helped her to run her business. And this support system probably made it possible for Betsy to succeed during the Revolution. And so we can see that Betsy Ross and her family were able to survive and even thrive during the Revolution. This was due to a combination of factors, including their hard work, creativity, luck, and the support of their family and community. Alright folks, that is going to bring us to the end of our time in Chapter 4. If you've enjoyed these videos and would like to support the channel while gaining access to exclusive content and perks, please consider supporting us through a membership platform. We've got lots of great perks to offer, including behind-the-scenes videos, early access to new episodes, and more. Thank you for watching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 5 of the Betsy Ross story, where we pick up with Betsy living in Philadelphia in 1776. There are many things that I want to talk about in this chapter, but we're going to focus on one thing in particular. And if you know anything about Betsy Ross and the story of the American flag, you know that this is probably one of the more important parts of her story because this is where she supposedly designed the first American flag. But there is one catch. There is no documentation for this event. All we have to go on is stories retold by members of the Ross family after Betsy died. So without further ado, let's dive into the story. Alright, so just to make sure we're clear on where we are in the timeline here, the Declaration of Independence has been signed, but it was not adopted yet. It would be a few weeks before they would actually adopt it officially. But regardless, the Continental Congress had met and established their headquarters at the Pennsylvania State House, which is now called Independence Hall. Betsy Ross and her husband John were living at 239 Arch Street, which is just a block away from the Pennsylvania State House. At this point in the story, Betsy is 41 years old and running a pretty successful business as a upholsterer and a wig maker. Now the story goes like this. One day in June of 1776, while Betsy was working in her shop, she saw a crowd gather outside. Curious, she went to a window to see what was going on, and she saw George Washington, Robert Morris, and George Ross walking together toward her house. She didn't know who they were at the time, but would have recognized George Ross since he was a member of the Continental Congress. Betsy knew him socially, as he was a customer of hers. The three men entered her shop and asked Betsy if she could design and sew a flag for them. She thought that they were just there for some upholstery work, and told them that she was unable to take on any new projects at the moment due to her workload. However, the men persisted and told her that they needed this flag immediately. That's when Betsy realized that they were not there as customers, but rather as representatives of the Continental Congress. At this point, Betsy agrees to help them. She goes out back to get some materials to make a pattern for the flag. And while she's gone, George Washington takes a piece of paper and draws a rough sketch of what the flag should look like. He comes back out to show it to her. And this is where the story gets a little bit confusing. Some versions say that Washington showed Betsy his sketch and told her to go ahead and make the flag based off of it. Others say that he showed it to her and told her that he liked the overall design, but he wanted her to make a few changes to it. And still others say that he never drew a sketch at all, and that's why Betsy's interpretation is different. Regardless, in Betsy's mind, she thought the six-pointed star looked more like a moltor than a flower, and she thought that five-pointed stars would look much better. She goes into the front room to grab some fabric to show Washington. She cuts 2 pieces of fabric, lays them down, and then pins a five-pointed star onto each piece. When Washington sees this, he's thrilled and tells her to go ahead and make the flag. He gives her a roll of fabric, tells her to make as many as she can, and says that they will pick them up the next day. Betsy worked late into the night and into the morning hours to finish the flags, and she completed 13 of them. The next day, the men came back to pick up the flags and pay Betsy for her work. Betsy refused payment, but they insisted, so she accepted $20 for her work. Then they took the flags to the Pennsylvania State House to present them to the Continental Congress. The story goes that as they were walking toward the State House, Washington turned to Robert Morris and said, "There is the place that will produce the first flag of the United States. On sit they got the flags to the Continental Congress. They loved them so much that they commissioned Betsy to make more." Over the next few months, she made 175 flags for the grand total of $175. And that, my friends, is the story of how Betsy Ross designed the first flag of the United States of America. Now, like I said earlier, there is no documentation for this event. We have no written accounts from anyone who was alive at the time. All we have is a story retold by members of the Ross family after Betsy died, and it was compiled into a book in 1870, which is more than 100 years after the fact. However, even though this story may not be true, it does line up with everything else that we know about Betsy. Like, up until this point in the story, she was known for being a very talented seamstress and upholsterer. She also lived in Philadelphia, which was really close to the Pennsylvania State House, where the Continental Congress was being held. And finally, Betsy was known for being a strong supporter of the Patriot cause. In addition to that, there are several other coincidences that just line up too well to ignore. For example, George Ross was a customer of Betsy's before this event supposedly happened. George Washington was staying at the home of Betsy's brother, James, while he was in Philadelphia. Robert Morris was also staying at James's house, and he was known to frequent Betsy's shop to purchase supplies. Furthermore, Betsy's husband, John, was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her son, George, fought in the Revolutionary War and was killed in battle. And her nephew, Thomas, also fought in the Revolutionary War and was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. On top of all that, Betsy was very involved in the local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which of course is an organization dedicated to honoring those who fought in the Revolutionary War. Even though none of this proves that Betsy designed the first flag, it does prove that she would have been a likely candidate to do so. I mean, think about it. Who were they gonna call? They were gonna call someone who was a talented seamstress, someone who lived nearby, someone who supported the Patriot cause, and someone who had connections to some of the most influential men of the time. To me, that sounds like Betsy Ross. However, until we find some primary source documentation, this story will remain just that, a story, but as far as stories go, it's a pretty good one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed making it. Please remember to hit that subscribe button and join us next week as we continue the story of Betsy Ross. Until then, stay safe and stay curious. Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, The Design of the Flag, a story of symbols, unity, and exceptional skill. Have you ever looked at the American flag and wondered about the deeper meaning behind its design? Well, you're about to find out. Let's start with the basics, which are anything but basic when you understand their significance. The flag features 13 stripes, alternating between red and white. These aren't just random decorative lines. Each stripe represents one of the original 13 colonies that stood together to declare independence. The red symbolizes hardiness and valor, a tribute to the courage it took to fight for their beliefs. The white stands for purity and innocence, reflecting the new nation's ideals and its fresh start. It's a powerful visual statement, a tally of the founding members of this great experiment in democracy. Now, let's look up to that beautiful blue canton in the corner. This blue field represents vigilance, perseverance, and justice. It's the moral bedrock upon which the nation was intended to be built. And nestled within this field of blue are the stars. Originally, there were 13 of them, just like the stripes. These stars weren't just scattered randomly. They were arranged in a specific, meaningful pattern. This brings us to one of the most iconic elements of the early flag designs, the circle of 13 stars. Why a circle? Think about it. A circle has no beginning and no end. It's a symbol of eternity, perpetuity, and, most importantly in this context, unity. By placing the stars in a circle, the design conveyed that each colony was equal, with no single colony having precedence over another. They were a united front, a constellation of states bound together in a common cause. This circular arrangement was a powerful message to the world and to themselves. We are one. It was a visual promise of equality and eternal fellowship among the states. So, who brought this powerful vision to life? While the exact historical details are debated, the legendary figure at the heart of the flag's creation is Betsy Ross. But she wasn't just a seamstress. She was a master of her craft. In the 18th century, stitching and fabric making were highly skilled and essential trades. Creating a flag that could withstand the elements, that could fly proudly on a battlefield or a ship's mast, required immense expertise. Betsy's skills were crucial. She knew which fabrics would be durable, which dyes would hold their color, and how to stitch the intricate pieces together with precision and strength. Legend has it that she was the one who suggested a 5-pointed star instead of the 6-pointed one originally proposed, demonstrating not just her skill but also her keen eye for design. She could fold a piece of cloth and, with a single snip of her scissors, create a perfect 5-pointed star. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a testament to her efficiency and ingenuity. Her contribution represents the vital role that artisans and craftspeople played in the founding of the nation. It wasn't just generals and politicians who built America. It was also people like Betsy who used their hands and their talents to create the very symbols of its identity. The flag is not just a piece of cloth. It's a tapestry woven with threads of courage, idealism, and the exceptional skill of its maker. Every stitch tells the story of a nation coming into being. As we look at the flag today, with its 50 stars, the core principles remain. Each new star represents a new state joining the Union, but the original symbolism endures. The stripes remind us of our foundation, the colors speak to our values, and the stars, born from that original circle of unity, represent the ever-expanding family of states. The story of the flag's design is a perfect microcosm of the American story itself. It's about taking bold ideas, liberty, unity, and justice, and giving them a tangible form. It required vision from leaders and skill from citizens. It's a reminder that great national symbols are born from both grand ideals and the humble, dedicated work of individuals. The flag that Betsy Ross is said to have stitched was more than an emblem. It was the first physical manifestation of a united American identity. And that's the fascinating story behind the design of the flag. A simple yet profound combination of stripes, stars, and colors that together tell the story of a nation's birth. It's a testament to the idea that symbols matter, and that behind every great symbol is a story of purpose, unity, and craftsmanship. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into our history. I hope it gives you a new appreciation for this iconic symbol the next time you see it. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We love having you here. Until next time, stay curious. Have you ever heard of Betsy Ross? Probably. Do you know why she's famous? Because she may have been the first person to sew the American flag. Well, not so fast. In this chapter, we're going to talk about fact versus legend. Let's get started. Chapter 7. Fact or legend? For our next question, let's go to Molly in New York. Molly asks, in Chapter 2, You said that George Washington presented the first flag to Betsy Ross. How do we know that? Did someone write it down somewhere? Well, no, but there are some good reasons to believe it's true. First, Betsy Ross's son wrote about it. He said, and I quote, "It is well known that the first flag of the United States was made by Mrs. Elizabeth Betsy Ross of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Now, obviously, when he said well known, he meant it was well known at the time. It was on until nearly a century later that people began to doubt Betsy Ross's role in creating the flag. Second, another man named John Parker wrote about it, too. He was an official for the Pennsylvania Society of the Sons of the Revolution. And in 1907, and I'm quoting again, the first flag of the United States was made by Mrs. John Ross. Afterwards, Mrs. John Baker, who lived in Arch Street near 4th. Now, Mr. Parker didn't actually say that Betsy Ross made the first flag. He just said she made one of the very early ones. But he also said she lived near 4th Street in Philadelphia. And you know where George Washington's headquarters was during the winter of 1777? 1778? Yep, right there on 4th Street. So it makes sense that he would have visited her shop. However, these stories were written more than 100 years after the fact, so they aren't considered primary sources. They're what we call secondary sources, and historians today argue about them. Some believe Betsy really did design the first flag, and some say it was just a family legend that got passed down and embellished over time. Before we move on, let me quickly recap how we got here. When the Continental Congress needed a new flag, they asked George Washington to get one designed and made. He took that request to a few different women in Philadelphia who made flags. One of those women was Betsy Ross. She designed the flag with the stars and stripes and presented it to the committee. They loved it and adopted it as the national flag of the United States. That much is pretty well documented. We even have a painting that shows the moment when she presented the flag to George Washington and the other members of the committee. But like I said, we don't have any contemporary evidence that says exactly how all that went down. We do have a letter that George Washington wrote to the committee after they adopted the flag, but it doesn't mention anything about Betsy Ross or how they chose the flag. Here's what he wrote. Philadelphia, June 14, 1777. At a meeting of the United States in Congress assembled June 14, 1777, resolved that the flag of the United States be 13 stripes, alternate black and white, and that the Union be a square containing 13 stars, white in a blue field. Resolved that the said flag be the standard of the United States in time of peace and war. Signed by order, G. Washington, President. What else do we have? Not much. Not much. We have documents from the Continental Navy that show that in 1777, the Navy paid Betsy Ross £300 for making several flags. These are called flag warrants. This is one of the flag warrants. It reads, and I'm quoting again, paid to Mrs. John Ross, or bearer, £355, 10 shillings. Philadelphia, July 12, 1777. Thomas Lynch, Jr., Purser. Now, we don't know from this document, or flag warrant, as they're called, how many flags she made or what the flags looked like. We also have shipping merchant records from 1777 that show that Betsy Ross's husband, John, imported a lot of material from England, including 2,400 iron wattles, which is an old word for bolts of cotton cloth. Historians think maybe some of this cloth was used to make the first flag, but again, it could have been used to make any of the hundreds of flags she made during the war. Other than those few documents, we have almost nothing from 1776. So, it's hard to know exactly what role Betsy Ross played in designing the first flag. All we really know for sure is that she made flags for the Continental Navy during the Revolutionary War. There are two lessons here. First, you can never be certain something happened just because lots of people told you it did. You have to look for evidence to back up the story. And second, most of the time, history is complicated. There are usually multiple sides to every story. That's why we love doing this series. Now, if you want to learn more about this topic, check out the links below. Now it's time for another quick break. Remember, you can find additional resources online. And now let's move on to part 4. As you know, this channel explores the history behind the Star-Spangled Banner and the War of 1812. And now, we're going to continue that exploration with Chapter 8 of my book, The Star-Spangled Banner. Chapter 8 is titled Der Rose-Families Claim, and it covers the period from 1870 through 1912, when the story of how Betsy Ross made the first American flag was handed down within her family and then eventually leaked to the public. In 1870, Betsy's grandson, William Canby, who was only 4 years old when Betsy died, presented the story of how his grandmother made the first flag at a public event in Philadelphia. This presentation caused a sensation in the city, making front-page news in several newspapers. And here's what they said under the head: "A national treasure saved by a Philadelphia woman." The Philadelphia Ledger reported that Mr. William C. Barry, an attorney of this city, related the following interesting incident in the early part of the present century. His grandmother, Mrs. Elizabeth Voigt, afterwards the wife of John Ross, deceased, had a shop in Market Street, below Arch, where she carried on the business of a seamstress. One day in the year 1876, General George Washington came into the city and called on Mrs. Ross to make him a flag for the new republic. She was accordingly employed to do the work, and the first flag that floated over Independence Hall was the one made by Mrs. Ross. Mr. Barry stated that this was a family tradition, and that he had always understood it to be a fact. He also stated that his grandmother died possessed of a trunk containing papers which would substantiate the truth of the statement. It seems like every time someone tells this story, there's something else added to it. Remember, this is a story that has been passed down orally for over 100 years before anyone wrote it down. And each time it's retold, more and more embellishments are added. For example, in an 1877 speech, Mr. Canby says that Betsy was working on a coat for President Washington when he came into the shop to ask her to make a flag. But at the January 1893 presentation at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Social Sciences, he says she was making a pair of trousers for him. Then in 1912, in an address to the Maryland Historical Society, he told the story the same way as it did in 1870, but he added that he saw the original order for the flag in his grandmother's Bible, even though he never mentioned it before. And he never mentioned it again after this speech. And by the way, no one has ever found such an order in any Bible. But the most significant change in the story comes during the 1912 presentation, when Mr. Canby makes the claim that Betsy was paid $25 for sewing the flag. For the first time, he says, his grandmother received $25 for the flag and saved the dollar account book in which the entry appeared. Unfortunately, he said, the book was destroyed in the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. Again, he never mentioned the account book before 1912, and no one has ever found any record of it since. Furthermore, even if such an account book did exist, it wouldn't necessarily mean that Betsy was paid $25 for the flag. She could have been paid that amount for several flags. It doesn't say that this was a payment for the very first flag. And many people seem to overlook the fact that Betsy's husband, John Ross, was a hatter and a businessman. So he could have used the account book to track his own business transactions, and not just his wife. As not everyone was convinced by Mr. Canby's story. Professor Edward C. Heimer, a historian at the University of Wisconsin, wrote, "The story is probably a myth. There is no tangible evidence to support it and much to negative it. The widely accepted legend rests solely on the assertion of a descendant of Mrs. Ross." He goes on to explain why no one commissioned Betsy Ross to make the first flag. At the time, flag making was an obscure trade, one which did not come under the heading of useful industry or reputable gainful occupation. To have secured a contract for such work would have been highly improbable. But even though historians doubted the story, the public ate it up. People were fascinated by the idea that an ordinary woman could play such an important role in the founding of the country. And as author David Hackett Fisher points out, Americans are sentimental people, and they like their history seasoned with tales of common folk who achieved uncommon things. Soon after William Canby's presentations in Philadelphia and Baltimore, stories about Betsy Ross appeared all over the country in places like New York, Texas, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, and even Alaska. There was a complete absence of skepticism in these articles. They simply repeated Mr. Canby's claims as if they were historical fact. Here's an example from the Des Moines Daily News in Iowa, July 1893. A flag story. How the first flag of the Union was made by a Philadelphia seamstress named Betsy Ross. This is a bit of local history, which should be remembered by every American. In 1776, Mrs. Ross kept a small shop in Philadelphia where she followed her vocation of a dressmaker. One day General Washington entered her shop and asked her to make a flag for the new nation. Startled at first by the request, she finally consented, and the first flag that floated over Independence Hall was the one that she made. She was paid $25 for her services, and saved the dollar account book in which the entry appeared. The book was accidentally burned in the Great Baltimore Fire of 1876. After this, she worked for the government as a flag maker and continued to make the flags until her death. Over the next few decades, authors began to include the story of Betsy Ross in their books. Here are just a few examples from The Story of the American Flag by James P. Baxter, published in 1901. The first flag of the United States was made by Mrs. Elizabeth Ross of Philadelphia, How We Know Italiano. The story of its creation was handed down to us by descendants of Mrs. Ross, and while there is no written evidence to confirm its truth, it is too good to be entirely disregarded. We can all agree that a flag was needed. Who was to make it? Someone whose business was to sew. Not a man, for women were employed to sew flags in those days. Where shall we find her? Among the seamstresses of Philadelphia. And there, mind you, was a woman skilled in the use of needle and thread, who was ready to do the state work when it came along. Mrs. Elizabeth Ross. Or how about this one from the American Girl's Book of Biography, published in 1907. It says, "The first flag of the United States was made by Mrs. Elizabeth Ross, who was a member of the Friends Church. Her son-in-law William Comby tells us that the order was given to her by General George Washington, and that she made it and delivered it to him at his own expense. She was paid $25 for it." Finally, let's look at the history of the American flag by Charles C. Naumburg, published in 1913. Mr. Naumburg said, "We owe our knowledge of the matter to a member of Mrs. Ross's family, Mr. William Canby, grandson of Mrs. Ross, who has kindly furnished us with the data here presented." According to family tradition, as well as a manuscript book of accounts still preserved, Mrs. Ross was paid $25 for the flag. This would indicate that the payment was made for a number of flags. For the first flag of the United States was certainly not worth that amount. However, there is no other evidence that Betsy Ross made any flags for the government, nor has any such account book ever been found. So that brings us to the end of Chapter 8. As you can see, the story of how his grandmother made the first flag was riddled with inconsistencies, and he never produced any real proof to back up his story. Yet the legend lived on. People wanted to believe it because it made Betsy Ross a hometown hero and because it was a good story. And besides, no one had any other theories about who made the first flag. In Chapter 9, we're going to explore some of the evidence that was used to argue against Betsy Ross. Some people claimed she did. You didn't even live in Philadelphia at the time, and others argued that women could possibly have been involved in such an important project. If you want to learn more about the War of 1812, check out my book, The Star-Spangled Banner. You can learn all about the war, the Battle of Baltimore, and how the national anthem was written. Thank you so much for watching. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and consider supporting the channel if you want to help me make more videos like this one. Chapter 9. Other early flag makers. So we've been talking about Betsy Ross and her famous flag. But did she really make the first American flag? Well, maybe not. There were other early Americans who made flags too, and some of them even beat Betsy Ross to the punch. So in this video, we're going to talk about these other flag makers and what their claims were. Let me introduce myself. I'm a professor of political science at a university. And this video is part of a series called The Secret History of the American Revolution, where we explore the fascinating stories that you won't learn anywhere else. Now, when it comes to the making of the first American flag, Betsy Ross is a household name. She's credited with sewing the first flag with the stars and stripes, which later became the official flag of the United States. However, Betsy Ross wasn't the only one who laid claim to the creation of the first American flag. There were others who stepped forward over the years to say that they had designed or sewn the very first flag. One such person was Francis Hopkinson, an American statesman and signer of the Declaration of Independence from New Jersey. He also happened to be an upholsterer, and a very creative one at that. In addition to his political career, He is remembered for designing many of the decorative elements for money and for his claim to having designed the first American flag. In 1798, while serving on a committee to oversee repairs to the nation's first capitol in New York, Hopkinson submitted an invoice for $25 for work he said he had done in 1776. His entry for August 1776 reads, 220 Ls of bunting, used in making the first American flag, $125. This entry was accompanied by a handwritten note explaining that he had used the bunting, a type of heavy cotton cloth, to make a flag for the Pennsylvania Navy, which had been accepted by John Hancock, president of the Continental Congress. At the time, the entry was accepted by the committee and paid without question. However, just over a decade later, there seems to have been some doubts about the accuracy of the charge. In 1798, 2 members of the committee went to inspect the flag, but it was nowhere to be found. Upon further investigation, the records relating to the purchase and acceptance of the flag were missing. Ultimately, the committee concluded that they could find no evidence to support Hopkinson's claim and refused to reimburse him. Hopkinson appealed to the full Congress, but they agreed with the committee's assessment. Disappointed and angry, Hopkinson stopped doing business with the federal government and began bad-mouthing the nation's leaders. He died believing that he would never get credit for his design. But why would he lie about something like this? Well, there are a few possible explanations. First off, maybe he was just looking out for himself. After all, he was an upholsterer, and he stood to gain from being the one who made the first American flag. If people knew that he was the one who had made it, then it was more likely that they would come to him to make their flags. Second, maybe he didn't realize that Betsy Ross had come forward with her own story. Or maybe he thought that his story was more important than hers. After all, he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a member of Congress. He was, after all, a founding father. Finally, it is possible that Hopkinson was telling the truth, and that he actually did make the first American flag. You see, while Hopkinson's story was never accepted by the general public, there was evidence that suggested that he might be telling the truth. For example, there were multiple seamstresses and upholsterers in Philadelphia who also made flags. One such seamstress was Margaret Manning, who received payment from the Pennsylvania Navy Board for making the first American flag. However, upon closer inspection, it turns out that this was not the first American flag that she made. She made multiple flags for the Navy over the course of the war. Another seamstress, Mary Pickersgill, also came forward to claim that she had made the first American flag. And yet another upholsterer, William Canby, also submitted an invoice for the making of the first flag. These multiple claims complicate the matter, because if there were so many people claiming to have made the first American flag, then it is possible that Hopkinson was simply telling the truth when he said that he made one. And if all of these people were making flags for the Pennsylvania Navy, then it is possible that Hopkinson's flag was simply lost or destroyed over time. The problem with Hopkinson's claim is that he did not submit his invoice until 1798, more than 20 years after he supposedly made the flag. Why would he wait so long to come forward? Was he trying to make a quick buck, or was he telling the truth? We may never know for sure. What makes this even more difficult is that there is little evidence that any of these early flag makers actually made a flag in the way that we think of it today. That is, there is little evidence that anyone actually sat down and sewed together a flag with alternating red and white stripes and a blue field with white stars. Instead, most of the flags that they made were simply large pieces of cloth with a single color that were used as banners or to drape over cannons. And while these may seem very different from the modern American flag, remember that the American flag as we know it today evolved over time. In fact, the first flags that were adopted by the Continental Congress did not look anything like the modern American flag. They were simply 13 alternating red and white stripes with no stars. This brings us back to Betsy Ross. Her famous flag, which featured stars set in a blue field, wasn't actually the first flag to feature stars. In fact, the first flag to feature stars was the Grand Union flag, which flew from the ship of the same name during the Battle of Brunei Island in February 1776. This flag featured a blue square in the upper corner with 6 white stars, representing the 6 colonies that had broken away from Britain. This was followed by the flag of the Continental Marines, which featured 13 stars in a circle on a dark blue field. So while Hopkinson may not have made the first American flag, it is still possible that he made one of the very early ones. And ultimately, It doesn't really matter who made the first American flag. What matters is that it was a symbol that represented a new nation, a nation that was built on the idea that all men are created equal. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think that Hopkinson was telling the truth when he said that he made the first American flag? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Every week I'll be publishing a new episode of The Secret History of the American Revolution, and you can always find more information on our website. Thanks for watching. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a symbol we see every day, but we're turning the clock back to a time when it meant something truly revolutionary. We're talking about the American flag, not as we know it now, but as it was in 1776. What did those early stars and stripes, or even the Grand Union flag before it, really mean to the people fighting for a new nation? Forget just a piece of cloth. This was the banner of a rebellion, a symbol of hope, and a declaration of a brand new identity. Let's set the scene. It's 1776. The air is thick with tension and the radical idea of independence. In this chaotic environment, you need something to hold on to, something that visually represents the cause. Enter the flag. For the soldiers of the Continental Army, a flag wasn't just for telling friend from foe on a smoke-filled battlefield. When they saw that banner waving, it was a visceral reminder of what they were fighting for: liberty, self-governance, and a future free from British rule. Imagine being a soldier, far from home, ill-equipped, and facing the most powerful army in the world. Seeing that flag raised high wasn't just a strategic marker. It was a shot of pure morale. It said, "We are one. We are ere. We will not back down." It transformed a scattered group of farmers, merchants, and artisans into a unified fighting force, the Continental Army. Each stripe, each star, represented a shared promise and a collective sacrifice. But the flag's power wasn't confined to the battlefield. Back in the towns and cities, for ordinary citizens, it was just as potent. Raising a flag on a public green or from your own home was a bold act of defiance. It was a public declaration of your allegiance to the patriot cause, and it came with real risks. It was a way of saying, "I am part of this movement," without uttering a single word. These weren't just decorations. They were tools of political expression. When a community raised a Liberty Tree flag, or a version of the Grand Union, it was a visual rallying point. It brought people together, fostering a sense of shared purpose and community in the face of uncertainty. It helped turn a philosophical debate about rights and governance into a tangible, popular movement. The flag gave the revolution a face, making the abstract concept of America something real and worth fighting for in daily life. For the leaders of the Revolution, the founding fathers like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, the flag served a crucial diplomatic and political purpose. On the world stage, a national flag signaled that the 13 colonies were no longer just a group of disgruntled British subjects. They were a unified entity, a nascent nation seeking recognition and allies. When John Paul Jones sailed with the Grand Union flag, it was a message to the world, especially to potential allies like France, that America was a serious contender, a sovereign power in its own right. Domestically, for leaders like General George Washington, the flag was an indispensable tool for building a professional army. He understood the need for standardized banners to instill discipline, order, and a sense of belonging among his troops. He knew that a soldier who fights for a flag, who fights for the nation it represents, is more committed than one who simply fights for pay. The flag helped him forge a national army from a collection of state militias, each with its own loyalties. It was the thread that began to stitch the colonies together into one nation. As the war raged on, the symbolism of the flag only grew deeper. Every battle won under its colors added to its legacy. It became a repository of shared memories of hardship, bravery, and loss. When the Flag Act of 1777 officially defined the Stars and Stripes, it was a pivotal moment. It codified the union of the 13 states into a single, visual emblem. The 13 stripes represented the original colonies, standing together, and the 13 stars in a blue field represented a new constellation, a new nation taking its place in the heavens. This design was brilliant in its simplicity and its powerful symbolism. It wasn't the flag of a king or a single ruler. It was the flag of a people, a republic. It represented the radical idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, with each star being an equal part of the whole. Think about the psychological impact. In a world dominated by monarchies, each with their own intricate royal crests, the American flag was refreshingly different. It was geometric, clean, and egalitarian. It symbolized a new kind of power, one based not on bloodline or divine right, but on principles of liberty and unity. It was a modern flag for a modern idea. When a soldier fell in battle, they were often wrapped in the flag, a final honor that connected their personal sacrifice to the larger national cause. It transformed a death from a personal tragedy into a martyr-esque contribution to the birth of a nation. The flag became a sacred cloth that bound the living to the dead, the past to the future, and the individual to the collective. It was the embodiment of the United States. So, when we look back at 1776, it's crucial to see the flag through their eyes. It wasn't a static object. It was a dynamic, living symbol evolving in its meaning with every passing day of the revolution. It was a tool of rebellion, a source of morale, a statement of identity, and a promise of independence. For the soldier in the trench, the citizen in the town square, and the leader on the world stage, the flag was the revolution made visible. It was the thread that wove together 13 disparate colonies into the fabric of a single nation, united in a struggle for freedom. It was the visual anchor for the very idea of America. Next time you see the flag, take a moment to think about its origins. Think about the courage it took to raise it for the first time, and everything it represented to those who risked it all in 1776. It's a powerful legacy. Thanks so much for joining me on this historical journey today. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the past. Drop a comment below and let me know what historical symbol you'd like us to explore next. Until then, stay curious. This is a Washington Spies episode. Betsy Ross may be best known for sewing the first American flag, but that was just one moment in her long life. This is chapter 11 of Our Serious Betsy's later life. After the war, Betsy and John Ross finally had some time to enjoy their lives together. They were both busy running their upholstery business, but they also had time to have fun. In October 1780, we find them at a party with some other founding fathers. The group decided to go to a tavern on Chestnut Street and then take a stagecoach to the Cedar Grove house, a popular inn about 5 miles outside the city. While they were there, they had a great time socializing. John Hancock stayed late into the night drinking and smoking cigars with John Ross while Betsy and Abigail Adams chatted about politics. But not all was well in Betsy's family. Her brother James was facing financial ruin. He was so desperate he offered to sell her his share of the family inheritance. She and John discussed it on their way home from the party and agreed to buy his share and her sister's share, too. They didn't want any more complications with the family business. James and her sister Anne would have to work out their own issues, but they did help them move to Philadelphia, where they could start new lives. Then tragedy struck. Anne died soon after arriving in Philadelphia. James survived, though, and over time Betsy's relationship with him greatly improved. Even though they had rough patches, Betsy never stopped being a loving aunt to his children. By 1782, Betsy and John were ready to leave Philadelphia and settle down on a farm. They bought a property outside of town and began making plans. John wanted to plant an orchard, and Betsy got busy designing furniture for their new home. But before they could do anything, Betsy fell ill with a fever. It kept her in bed for months, and she almost died. Luckily, she recovered, but the experience scared her. She wrote to a friend, "My time is nearly out, I fear. If I should die, my dear friend, I leave you my unfinished furniture and a legacy of love to you and your good husband." Clearly, she thought she might not survive. Fortunately, this wasn't the end for Betsy. She and John eventually moved to their farm outside of Philadelphia. They lived in a simple farmhouse. John took care of the farm and made furniture while Betsy sewed, preserved food, and took care of the house. She missed the excitement of the city, though, and soon began entertaining guests at their home. George Washington visited, as did Marquis de Lafayette. In January 1784, Betsy had a very special guest. Her daughter, Elizabeth, or Betsy Jr., was getting married. She wrote to a friend, "My eldest daughter is going to be married to the grandson of Dr. Franklin, which makes 3 couples of the second marriage in this city." You see, Betsy and John's younger daughter, Sally, was already married to Dr. Benjamin Rush, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So Betsy Jr.'s marriage to William Temple Franklin would make 2 sets of grandchildren for both Dr. Franklin and John Adams. That must have been quite a wedding for the newlyweds. Betsy used some of her old wedding curtains as tablecloths. In her later years, she enjoyed watching her daughter's children play around the house. She wrote to a friend, "I have just come from seeing my 2 little granddaughters dancing in the street. One is not yet 4 years old, and the other 2 summers. How delightful must be the gambols of such innocence." Betsy loved living on the farm, but she and John still had dreams of adventure. In 1793, they sold their house and most of their possessions, then set sail for France with their friend Thomas Jefferson. He was the U.S. Minister to France, and President George Washington asked him to accept John Ross's commission to purchase some very nice furniture for the president's house. So off they went, traveling on a ship for 8 weeks. While they were gone, yellow fever struck Philadelphia. Many people died, including Betsy and John's youngest daughter, Sally. When they returned to the States, they learned what had happened and immediately traveled to Philadelphia to be with their grandchildren. John Ross wrote to a friend about how they learned of their loss. "We found the whole family overwhelmed with the greatest affliction, the loss of a daughter and sister. We saw them in the midst of their affliction and can truly say that we never saw a family, all of them, conduct themselves with more dignity and resignation. After spending time comforting their family, they buried their daughter and then went back to France." Once again, Betsy was busy furnishing homes for her friends. She recovered chairs for Mrs. Washington and furnished rooms for the family of General Knox. She even made window curtains for the ambassador's house. Although she hated the way they turned out, she told her friend that she was disappointed in her work and blamed it on a new illness she developed. She could never quite get the hang of upholstering again. When they left France, Betsy and John returned to Philadelphia. It was a city they knew well and they liked. Betsy had spent many happy years there, and it was now the nation's capital. John continued his work as a cabinet maker, and Betsy designed clothes for herself and her friends. One of her favorite social activities was having a dress circle at the theater. She and her friends would attend a performance and then discuss the actors' costumes as they sipped chocolate. In 1803, Betsy experienced another terrible loss. Her son, John Jr., died of tuberculosis. He had been sick for a while, and the whole family journeyed to Charleston to be with him when he passed away. Betsy's friend wrote to her expressing her deepest sympathies. "You have felt the heavy hand of affliction, and I dare say you feel as if no human grief could ever have a superior in yours. It is impossible for us to add anything to your present burthen of sorrow, but we will do everything in our power to alleviate the load." "Oh, Betsy, you have now entered the vale of sorrow. Let us, therefore, each endeavor to soothe your afflicted heart." As a widow once again, Betsy turned to her work for comfort. She supplied furniture and linens to the White House when James Madison and his wife Dolly moved in. She was pleased to be part of the new administration, but she was also very worried about what was happening in Europe. War seemed imminent, and she feared for her country. At the age of 70, Betsy was about to face another new chapter in her life, but this time she wouldn't have to face it alone. She had a kind and supportive partner who would help her through the rest of her adventures. And now we are at the end of Chapter 11. Come back next time for Chapter 12, Part 1, as we continue the story of Betsy's life. Don't forget to subscribe. If you enjoyed this episode, check out the previous episodes in this series by clicking on the cards in the upper right-hand corner. Thanks for watching. Chapter 12. Betsy in American Memory. Imagine datit es the year 1870. You are an American, and you want to impress your friends with a good yarn about the early days of your country. What do you tell them? Well, perhaps you speak of George Washington crossing the Delaware, or Paul Revere's ride, or the Boston Tea Party. Maybe. All those stories have been around for a while, and everybody knows them. But what if you wanted to tell them something fresh, something new, something that would really make their jaws drop? Well, in that case, you might want to talk about Betsy Ross and how she helped the Continental Congress design the first flag of the United States. But why would you talk about Betsy Ross? Because by the 1870s, that story was brand new, having been invented only a few decades before. By then, Americans had been telling each other that Betsy Ross was the one who designed the American flag for almost 50 years. And by that point, The legend had become so popular that her name was synonymous with patriotism. In Philadelphia, children sang songs about her, and old men told stories of her at barbecues. Her picture hung in post offices all over the country, and department stores sold cookie cutters in her likeness. The first American president, George Washington, was considered a national treasure. But the woman who supposedly helped him design the nation's flag was practically a deity. Americans idolized her, and they kept her story alive because they needed her and her story to fill in the gaps in their history. The 19th century was the era of American nostalgia, and nobody was more nostalgic than women. For most of U.S. history, women hadn't been allowed to participate in politics. They couldn't vote, and they rarely held public office. So many of them took an interest in history and genealogy instead. They joined historical societies, wrote family histories, and collected antiques. But there was a problem with this pastime. A big one. Most of the artifacts these women were hunting for and the stories they were collecting belonged to men. Women weren't allowed to be antiquarians, or historians, or legislators. But they could be wives, and mothers, and sisters. So women's contributions to history were usually invisible unless they were the wives, mothers, or sisters of important men. That is to say, unless they were Martha Washington or Abigail Adams, women's names rarely ended up in the history books. And that presented a bit of a problem for women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were trying to convince Congress to grant them the right to vote. How could they possibly argue that women deserved political representation when women had contributed nothing to the founding of the nation? Well, they couldn't. Enter Betsy Ross, whose story was perfect for American nostalgia. She was the mother of 2 boys who served in the Revolutionary War. Her husband died in the war effort, and to make ends meet, she took over the family business, which happened to be one of the largest businesses in America, a textile factory. She also happened to be a member of the Continental Congress and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, we're just kidding about that last one. But that didn't stop historians from saying she was. The story goes that one day George Washington showed up at her door and asked her to design a flag for the new country. And when he showed her the flag with the stars in a circle, she suggested that they should be in a field of blue instead. And that's how the first American flag was born. Then she handed it to him and said, "Don't forget, my dear friend, the lady who made the first flag for you." Even though Betsy Ross never actually did any of those things, Americans loved the story anyway, because it gave them a way to remember their history through a distinctly feminine lens. To 19th century Americans, Betsy Ross was a symbol of everything good about America. She was a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, and a patriot. In other words, she was the ideal American woman. And that's why the story of Betsy Ross became so popular. It wasn't that she did anything particularly special, but that her life fit into the mold of the ideal American. Betsy Ross wasn't the only legendary figure that Americans created in the 19th century. Paul Revere was another, and you can learn all about his legendary status in our episode on him. Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. It is easy to think of American history as a straightforward narrative of one people's struggle for freedom against a tyrannical king. But that story wasn't put together until after the war was over. And once it was selectively told. In other words, Americans chose to remember certain stories and not others. And that's still true today. Our understanding of the past is always changing, as new evidence is uncovered and different perspectives come to light. Historians have long known that the Betsy Ross story was made up, but now they know exactly who made it up and why. Historians have known for a while that the first person to tell the Betsy Ross story was a man named William Canby. He told it in a speech in 1872, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, an audience of and in that speech, he claimed that he had heard the story from Betsy Ross's daughter directly. Unfortunately, that isn't quite true. The speech was based entirely on documents that Canby had found in the Pennsylvania State Archives. Those documents were letters written by members of the Continental Congress asking Betsy Ross to make some flags for them, but they don't say anything about her designing the first flag. That detail is completely made up. So where did Canby get that idea? We'll tell you right after. When William Canby went up to Betsy Ross's grave in 1867, he left a small coin on top. It was a large cent, the largest U.S. coin in circulation at the time. It was worth $5, and it bore the image of George Washington. Canby hoped that whoever was taking care of the graveyard would take the coin and put it in the box, holding Betsy Ross's remains. And when they opened the box, they would find the clipping of his speech with instructions to deliver it to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. This was Canby's way of honoring Betsy Ross and ensuring that her legacy lived on. And honor her, he did. That speech launched Betsy Ross into the American consciousness. After hearing her story, everyone wanted a piece of it. Department stores sold Betsy Ross dolls and pictures. Songwriters wrote songs about her, and orators delivered speeches about her. Everyone was telling her story, except, of course, the Ross family. When Canby first visited the Ross family home, he had spoken with Betsy Ross's grandson, who encouraged him to tell the story of his grandmother. But after Canby's speech, the Ross family tried to stop him. They sent him letters, begging him to stop, but he refused. He was too invested in the story at this point, and he was unbound to let the Ross family or anyone else stop him. Today, we know that Canby was motivated by something more than just a desire to preserve history. He was a racist, and he stood to profit from the publication of his speech. In the 1860s, Canby worked for the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, or simply the Freedmen's Bureau, and his job was to confiscate property from former Confederates and sell it to freed slaves. His plan was to use his connections with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to collect money from white Southerners who wanted to reclaim their property. He promised them that if they donated money to the society, he would put in a good word for them with the Bureau and help them get their property back. And by donating money to the Historical Society, they would also be helping to preserve the heritage of the state of Pennsylvania. So it was a win-win situation for everyone involved. The only problem was that it didn't work. The Bureau didn't care about the Historical Society's opinion on the matter, and neither did freed slaves. Still, that didn't stop Canby from trying, and his efforts paid off in the end. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania received a huge donation from former Confederates, and Canby got rich. It wasn't until recently that historians discovered Canby's scheme. Until then, they assumed that the Betsy Ross story had been passed down directly from Betsy Ross's daughter, as William Canby had claimed. But that can't have been the case. Otherwise, where was the story for the next 100 years? Why didn't anyone else tell it? Why did it wait until 1870? Well, the answer is simple. The story waited until it was useful. Betsy Ross herself had nothing to do with the invention of the flag. She didn't design it, order it, or help make it. But William Canby didn't care about that. He had an audience hungry for stories, and he was happy to provide them, even if they weren't quite true. Today, we remember Betsy Ross because we need to remember her. We need someone to represent the feminine ideal, and she fits the bill perfectly. She was a wife and mother who ran a business and helped out the Continental Congress. What more could you ask for? And that's why Americans will continue to celebrate Betsy Ross for years to come. As you can see, the story of Betsy Ross isn't really a story at all. It's an invention, and that raises some questions about the nature of historical truth. Can we ever really know the truth? What does it mean for something to be true? And how do we decide which stories to tell and which ones to ignore? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting us on a crowdfunding platform. Alright, welcome to Chapter 13 of our series, where we take a look at some of the places mentioned in the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, before we get started, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an exciting episode. And if you like what we do, why not join us as a member on our support page? As always, chapter numbers and the places we've been to can be found below. Alright, Chapter 13, The Betsy Ross House. So our banner tells the story of a woman who lived in a house in Philadelphia. But which house was it? Well, fortunately for us, it's still there. So let's go and take a look at it. So, to begin with, this is what the house looks like today. It is located at 239 Arch Street in Old Town, Philadelphia, and is open to the public as a house museum. But before we see what it looks like inside, let's take a quick look around the outside. On the left side of the home, just above the front door, you'll see the date 1799 inscribed in the stone. This is the year that Betsy Ross and her husband, John, purchased the house from Rebecca Young, the widow of John Young, a wealthy merchant who had died the previous year. Before the Rosemont family, the house had been occupied by Rebecca and her late husband. However, they had only owned the property for a few years. They had purchased the house from Thomas Lynch, Jr., whose father, Thomas Lynch, Sr., had built the house between 1772 and 1776. Thomas the younger then inherited the house and sold it to Rebecca and John. Young Winnie went to serve as a captain in the Continental Navy. That was quite a real estate carousel. But regardless of all the comings and goings, one thing that remained constant was the house itself. So now let us head inside to see how Betsy's home has been preserved for us to enjoy today. The first room that we're going to look at is the entry hall. This was the original entrance to the house, and the first room that visitors would have seen when they came to call on the Ross family. On the right side of the room is a staircase leading to the second floor. This was the only change made to the first floor during the Ross's time in the house. Straight ahead, however, is a pair of doors that open up into the parlor. Now, directly opposite these doors are two windows with shutters, allowing natural light to flood into the room. Beneath those windows, and stretching the length of the wall on the far side of the room, is a large mantelpiece holding two mirrors over a marble fireplace. This was the social center of the home. In fact, all the major action of the story takes place here. As you know, it was in this room that George Washington, along with some members of the Constitutional Convention, visited Betsy to request that she design a flag for the new nation. And this is also the room where she presented them with the first flag featuring stars arranged in a circle which they rejected, and then presented them with the flag that we all know today, with the stars in rows of 3, 6, and 3. There are two more rooms on the first floor, a dining room off of the entry hall, and a kitchen at the back of the house. Both rooms were furnished in period style, reflecting the types of items that would have been used during Betsy's lifetime. Upstairs, we find 5 bedrooms, each named for a member of the Ross family who lived there during their occupancy. Of particular interest, however, is one of the second-floor windows in the rear of the house. From this window, Betsy could have looked out onto the street and seen the Liberty Bell at the distance. In addition to the preserved interior spaces, the museum also maintains the garden behind the house. It's not exactly how it would have appeared during Betsy's lifetime. Bad D plants and flowers were chosen to reflect the types of things that would have been grown during that time period. But enough about the house itself. What about the legend? How does it connect to this place? Well, the connection is obvious. The house still stands, and that in and of itself anchors the legend to a physical location. But the story doesn't end there. You see, following the death of her husband, John, in 1803, Betsy continued to live in the house until 1817. That's 18 years. And during that time, the legend of how she had created the American flag grew and spread throughout the country. Visitors began arriving at her doorstep, seeking to shake her hand or just catch a glimpse of the elderly woman who had played such an important role in the creation of the nation's flag. She obliged them all, even though she was growing older and weaker. In fact, she became known for sitting in a chair in the front parlor and greeting guests for hours at a time. Can you imagine if she were still alive today? She'd probably need to sit down for a break after meeting all the tourists at some point. However, the strain of meeting people proved too much for her health, and she eventually had to stop. Even so, people continued to come to the house, and she would simply stand at the front window and wave to them. Sadly, Betsy passed away in 1817 and was buried in the nearby Laurel Hill Cemetery. Over the years, the house changed hands several times, being occupied by a variety of families and individuals. During the mid-1800s, it was used as a stable and a carriage house for a nearby hotel, but eventually it was slated for demolition. Fortunately, however, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania intervened and purchased the house in 1900. They restored it and opened it up to the public as a house museum. Today, the Betsy Ross house continues to be open to the public for guided tours. In addition to seeing the beautifully preserved interior and exterior of the house, visitors can also explore exhibits on Betsy's life and times, including an extensive collection of letters, documents, and artifacts related to her work as a businesswoman and her role in the creation of the American flag. The house also hosts a variety of educational programs, including lectures, workshops, and classes for students of all ages. The house is definitely worth a visit if you're ever in the area. It has a beautiful example of early American architecture, and it has also a reminder of the important role that women like Betsy Ross played in the founding of our nation. Well, that concludes our look at Chapter 13 of the Star-Spangled Banner. Tune in next time for another exciting episode, and remember, America runs on Duncan. Hello, friends. It's me. This is Chapter 14, The Legacy of the Stars and Stripes. The year was 1777. George Washington was in Philadelphia with his ragtag army camped out on the freezing banks of the Schuylkill River. A young widow named Betsy Ross was running her shop, which specialized in making flags for the shipping industry. She had just finished up a commission for the Pennsylvania Navy when she received a visit from two men who identified themselves as being from the Continental Congress. They told her that they were looking for someone to make a flag for the new United States, and then one of them reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. And there in front of Betsy Ross was the first design for the flag of the United States of America, a field of stars on a blue background with 13 white stripes, alternating with 6 red ones. But this flag wasn't going to have just 13 stars. As the country grew, so would the number of stars on the flag, with each new star representing a new state joining the Union. So if there were 50 states, then there should be 50 stars on the flag. But before we get started on this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Okay, let's continue. One of the visitors explained to Betsy that the 13 stars would represent the original 13 colonies, and that the alternating red and white stripes represented the unity between the colonies. Then he asked Betsy, "Can you make this for us?" She looked at the sketch that had been provided and said, "Of course I can." However, she did suggest one change, and that was instead of having 6 pointed stars, she could make 5 pointed ones. And since she was an accomplished seamstress, she was able to complete the job in less than a week. On May, the flag was presented to the Continental Congress. The members loved it. They immediately ordered 12 more flags to be made in the exact same pattern. And to commemorate the occasion, the Continental Congress gave Betsy Ross a silver punch bowl and the right to display the first flag in her shop window. However, the flag wasn't perfect. Over time, several different designs were considered, and in 1912, an official government board was formed, whose duty it was to oversee any changes to the flag. They would become known as the Flag Board, and they were given the power to approve any proposed changes to the flag. The first change came in 1795, when Vermont and Kentucky became the 14th and 15th states. At Tot Point 2, new stars were added to the flag, but the stripes were not changed, even though this meant that the red stripes were no longer alternating with the white ones. In 1818, when Mississippi became the 20th state, the decision was made to go back to having alternating stripes, so 2 new stripes were added, making the flag 13 red and 13 white. Then, in 1867, when Nevada became the 36th state, the flag had 34 stars arranged in a circle. But after this, people began to think that maybe the flag should have more than just stars. So in 1912, the Flag Board was established, and in 1916, the board decided to add 6 more stars to the flag to represent the 6 newest states. This brought the total number of stars on the flag to 48. The Flag Board kept suggesting new designs, but Congress rejected them all. Finally, in 1959, when Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states, the flag was changed to its present design with 50 stars in a constellation pattern. Some people have criticized the arrangement of the stars, saying that they don't form a constellation. But this is incorrect, because in astronomy, a constellation is a group of stars that appear close together in the sky, even though they might be very far apart in space. The stars on the American flag do the exact same thing. They appear close together on the flag, but they aren't necessarily close together in space. So the stars on the American flag are indeed a constellation. Over the years, many people have argued over who designed the American flag. Some people say it was Betsy Ross, while others claim it was Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. There is even a legend that the shape of the stars on the flag was inspired by a piece of cheese. However, none of these stories can be proven, and the truth is that we may never know for sure who actually designed the first flag. But there is one thing that we do know. On June, the Continental Congress voted to accept Betsy Ross's flag as the official flag of the United States of America. And whether or not she actually designed the first flag, her name will forever be tied to it. That's why this chapter is named in her honor. As for Betsy Ross herself, she lived a long life. She outlived her husband, John Ross, and their son, William Canby Ross, who died in the Revolutionary War. She also outlived her second husband, Judge John Clifton, who died in 1812. After that, she moved in with her daughter and son-in-law, where she spent her remaining days. She continued to run her business until she was nearly 80 years old. She died on April 23, 1837, and she was buried next to her first husband and son in the old Jewish cemetery on Vine Street. Today, the story of Betsy Ross and the creation of the first American flag is a popular tourist attraction in Philadelphia. Every year, thousands of people visit the Betsy Ross house to learn about her story and see the flag that she designed. There's even a legend that says if you touch the first flag, you'll be granted good luck for the rest of your life. Of course, this isn't true, but it is still fun to try to find the hidden star on the replica flag displayed in the house. Throughout American history, the flag has been used as a symbol of unity, freedom, and democracy. It's flown from the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, and the smallest, Fort's Castle in Wales. It's flown in outer space and on every continent on Earth. No matter where you go, if you see the flag of the United States, you know that somewhere nearby there is a group of people celebrating their freedom. The flag has been through a lot of changes throughout its lifetime. It started out with just 13 stars, but now it has 50. The stripes have been rearranged and the shape of the stars has been altered. But no matter what changes have been made to the flag, one thing has remained constant: the colors, the stars, and the stripes. These are the colors of the United States of America, and they will never change. So next time you see the flag waving in the wind, remember all of the changes it has been through and the people who fought for the freedom that it represents. And if you want to learn more about the American Revolution, check out Chapter 13, The Liberty Tree. Thanks for watching, friends. See you next time. Betsy Ross is a name that echoes through American history, a figure synonymous with the birth of a nation. Her story, a blend of reality and legend, has captured the hearts and minds of generations. Today, we stand at the close of our journey through her remarkable life. And as we do, let's take a moment to reflect on the enduring legacy of this extraordinary woman. In our previous episodes, we've explored the pivotal moments that shaped Betsy's life, from her early years in colonial Philadelphia to her fateful encounter with George Washington and the Continental Congress. We've seen how she transformed an ordinary meeting into an extraordinary event, forever linking her name to the creation of the first American flag. But as we bring this series to a close, I want to do something a little different. Instead of focusing on specific historical events, I want to delve into the broader themes that have sustained Betsy's legacy over the centuries. Why does the story of Betsy Ross continue to resonate so deeply within American memory? What is it about her tale that has made her an enduring symbol of patriotism and national identity? To answer these questions, we must first acknowledge the inherent ambiguity surrounding Betsy's story. Historical records are incomplete, leaving room for speculation and embellishment. Over the years, various accounts have emerged, each adding its own layer to the narrative. Some highlight her business acumen, while others emphasize her patriotism. Still, others focus on her role as a symbol of female empowerment in a male-dominated world. The truth is, Betsy's story is not a singular event frozen in time, but rather a fluid narrative that has evolved and adapted throughout history. As new generations have come along, they have seen themselves in Betsy's story, finding inspiration and guidance in her example. This adaptability has been the key to her enduring legacy. One of the most compelling aspects of Betsy's story is the way it captures the essence of American values. In a nation founded on principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance, Betsy's tale serves as a powerful reminder of the ideals that have guided the nation since its inception. Her story is not merely a historical account, but a reflection of the aspirations and values that define the American character. Let me pause here for a moment to consider the significance of the American flag itself. It's more than just a piece of cloth with stars and stripes. It's a potent symbol of unity, freedom, and the shared identity that binds Americans together. The flag represents the hopes and dreams of millions who have come to call this land their home, and Betsy's role in its creation elevates her to an iconic status. She is the embodiment of the American spirit, a weaver of cloth and a weaver of dreams. As we reflect on Betsy's legacy, it's essential to recognize the complexity of her story. She was a product of her time, shaped by the social norms and expectations of colonial America. Yet within those constraints, she found ways to express her creativity and contribute to the cause of American independence. She didn't seek fame or fortune, but her actions had far-reaching consequences. In a world where women's voices were often silenced, Betsy's story offers a glimmer of hope and inspiration. She may not have been the first woman to challenge societal norms, But her story reminds us that, even in the face of adversity, one person can make a difference. Betsy's legacy extends beyond the realm of textiles and into the hearts and minds of those who strive for equality and justice. I want to end this series with a quote from the historian David McCullough. Speaking about Betsy Ross and the creation of the American flag, he said, "How fitting that a woman should have been the first to raise that flag. Not only because of the part she played in designing it, but because of what the flag came to symbolize not only for our country's birth, but for our country's soul." These words resonate deeply with me, and I hope they inspire the same sense of wonder and reflection in you. We've traveled back in time to witness the birth of a nation and the pivotal role that Betsy Ross played in that momentous event. We've seen how her story, though shrouded in myth and legend, continues to captivate and inspire people around the world. But now it is time to return to our own time and carry forward the lessons and insights we've gained from Betsy's remarkable journey. Throughout our exploration of her story, we've encountered themes that transcend time and place. We've witnessed the power of following one's passions, the importance of seizing opportunities, and the enduring legacy of those who dare to dream big. Now it's up to us to put these lessons into practice in our own lives. As we go about our daily routines, let us remember the courage and determination that defined Betsy's spirit. Let us embrace challenges as opportunities for growth and strive to make a positive impact on the world around us. In doing so, we'll honor the legacy of Betsy Ross and ensure that her story continues to inspire future generations. I hope this series has given you a new perspective on American history and the role that everyday people like Betsy Ross can play in shaping our world. If you enjoyed this journey through time, please don't hesitate to show your support. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and inspire us to keep bringing these stories to life. As we say goodbye to Betsy Ross and the era in which she lived, let us also remember the power of storytelling. Stories have the ability to transport us to different times and places, allowing us to experience history firsthand. They connect us to the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us and remind us of the values and ideals that have shaped our world. So, keep listening, keep learning, and keep sharing these stories with others. In doing so, we'll ensure that the legacy of Betsy Ross and other historical figures continues to thrive. As I conclude this reflection, I invite you to take a moment to appreciate the beauty of the present. The time is now, and this moment is all we truly have. Let us cherish the opportunity to learn from the past, to live fully in the present, and to shape a better future for ourselves and for generations to come. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through time. Together, we've uncovered the fascinating story of Betsy Ross, a woman whose contributions to American history have echoed through the ages. From her humble beginnings in colonial Philadelphia to her pivotal role in the creation of the first American flag, Betsy's tale has captivated our imaginations and inspired our sense of patriotism. We've delved into the historical records, uncovering the facts and separating them from the legends that have grown around Betsy's story. Along the way, we've discovered the deeper meaning behind the creation of the American flag and the enduring legacy of Betsy Ross. Now, as we bring this journey to a close, I want to leave you with a final thought. Betsy's story is not just a tale of the past. It's a timeless reminder of the values and principles that have shaped our nation. Her story is a testament to the power of hard work, determination, and the pursuit of one's passion. It's a story that continues to resonate with people of all ages, inspiring them to be the best version of themselves. As you go forward in your own journey, I encourage you to embrace the lessons that Betsy's story offers. Pursue your dreams with unwavering determination. Stay true to your values, and never lose sight of the things that matter most. Remember, the world is full of opportunities, and it's up to each of us to seize them and make the most of them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Betsy Ross and the incredible story that has made her a true American icon. If you're eager for more historical adventures, please don't forget to show your support. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and inspire us to keep bringing these stories to life. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep exploring the rich tapestry of our shared history. Thank you, and happy learning.